Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we are really getting into one of the most fundamental struggles in political history, I think. It's this constant fight.
Yeah, the fight to establish a rule of law over, well, the rule of the mob.
Exactly. And it's not abstract theory, is it? It's the physical reality every single governing body faces when it tries to manage human aggression, especially in public life.
It really is the ultimate test of whether a state is legitimate. I mean, how does a government move beyond just saying public violence is bad vis, as the Romans called it, to actually, successfully setting up ways to resolve conflict?
So that's what we're doing today. We're looking at the historical blueprints,
Right.
mostly focusing on Athenian democracy and then the later Roman Empire.
Right, to see where the law actually managed to channel human passion and, frankly, where it just completely failed.
And our sources, they offer a really fascinating mix of legal strategies, political moves.
Oh, absolutely. We've got Athenian efforts to regulate deep-seated enmity, this concept of ecthra.
And then Roman legal methods, these juristic tools they used for handling incredibly complex imperial law.
Plus the really chilling impact of social status on who actually got punished and how severely.
Yeah, we'll definitely unpack what happens when the law tries to manage human passion, but also when it reflects social prejudice.
And the core of this deep dive, really, is understanding the state's ability or inability to keep its monopoly on force. Because the story of trying to legally enforce laws against political violence, against public violence, well, that tells you everything about how healthy the institutions are.
So when political decay sets in, like we saw so dramatically in Rome, the law itself just isn't enough, is it? It can't stop that descent into chaos.
No, it can't. And that decay, especially in Rome, you see it marked so clearly by the failure to curb things like armed assembly or the intimidation of magistrates. That's the vis we're talking about.
Okay, let's unpack this first part then. Athens. It seems quite different from, say, places where private blood feuds were just the norm. They seem to have directly tackled this problem of taking raw anger.
Yeah, often politically charged anger or private feuds.
And tried to translate that somehow into a really controlled legal process.
They absolutely did. And they seem to understand that violence, well, it rarely starts with a weapon, does it? It often starts with a word, an insult.
Right.
So the Athenian system seems inherently concerned with stopping conflicts before they get to the absolute worst point. Our source material, it actually lays out this progression really meticulously.
A kind of chain of escalation.
Exactly. A chain that the law tried to map out and interrupt at every single stage.
So how did that work? What were the stages?
Well, it starts with loidorius. That's basically formalized verbal abuse. We're talking shaming, mockery, public insults, things designed to dishonor someone.
Okay. Stage one, words.
Right. And if that goes unchecked, loidorius can quickly escalate to plagai. That's physical blows, simple assault.
So words to blows. Makes sense.
Then, if those blows actually draw blood, you move up the scale to traumata. That means serious wounds, significant injury.
Getting much more serious now.
Definitely. And then, tragically, the final step, the irreversible one in that progression, is thanatos, death.
So the law was designed to step in at each point, to break that cycle.
Precisely. To break that natural escalating cycle of vengeance and retribution that would otherwise just spiral.
I guess the genius of it, or maybe just the chilling practicality, was this idea of preventative control. The law's objective wasn't just punishment after the fact, but making sure the penalty for each step, the insult, the blow, the wound, was decided by the laws themselves.
Not by the, and this is a quote, anger or will of the randomly encountered person, te tu prostichontos orge made bulise.
Wow. So taking random, passionate street justice, basically, and putting it firmly in the hands of the state.
That was the goal, to institutionalize it. And this institutionalization, it reached its most solemn and formalized point in the homicide court, the diaphonu.
The homicide lawsuit.
Exactly. This procedure, it had its roots way back in Draco's reforms, the famously severe ones.
Right.
And this court was the absolutely critical system for taking that raw, immediate need for vengeance after a killing.
And turning it into measured, state-controlled justice.
Yes.
Yeah.
Channeling it.
And the scope of who could be held responsible, that seems quite forward-thinking, too. They didn't just go after the person who actually struck the blow.
No, not at all. The rule was surprisingly broad, actually. Equal liability wasn't just on the person who killed with their own hands, but on anyone who conspired to kill, anyone involved in the planning.
That's significant. So the state wasn't just focused on the act, but the intent, the conspiracy behind it.
Absolutely. Which makes the daikifuno not just a way to punish homicide, but also a tool for managing political plots or, deep family feuds that might lead to killing.
But interestingly, even as they brought homicide under state control, they didn't completely sever the ties to the victim's family, did they? It seems like they kept that link.
They did, but it was a very controlled link, almost like a bridge, as you said, between the old world of vendetta and the new world of state law. But a very narrow bridge.
How so? Who could actually bring the prosecution?
It was severely restricted, reserved only for relatives, and even then, only within a very specific degree of kinship, down to the descendant first cousin once removed if the victim was a free citizen.
And for a slave?
Then the right belonged only to the owner, no one else.
So this restriction, it served a purpose then. It wasn't just arbitrary.
Oh, definitely not. It achieved two things, really. First, it gave the prosecution legitimacy by tying it directly to personal grievance, to the family's loss.
Right, it wasn't just some random busybody.
Exactly. And second, it prevented basically every citizen from using any death as an excuse to pursue their own unrelated agendas or vendettas in court. It kept things focused.
And the process itself, the timeline, it sounds incredibly slow, almost deliberately so.
Oh, it was absolutely deliberate. The whole judicial process was designed to be meticulous, slow, public, and quite ritualistic. It must have been intended to physically cool the tempers of the grieving family.
So what did it involve?
Well, right after a killing, the victim's relatives had to make a public proclamation, usually at the funeral, a declaration of intent to prosecute.
Okay.
That was followed by the basileus, he was the archon, the magistrate specifically overseeing the homicide courts. He would register the lawsuit and then issue a second official proclamation.
So multiple public announcements.
Yes. And then came this critical waiting period. 3 separate preliminary hearings called prodicatiae. These were held in 3 successive months, one each month.
3 months of preliminary hearings.
Before the actual trial even began. The trial itself was only held in the 4th month after the initial registration.
4 months. 4 months of required cooling off time, these public rituals, preliminary arguments. That structure, it almost forces the family away from raw rage, doesn't it? Makes them focus on legal prep.
That's exactly the point, I think. It channels that violent energy, the potential for a blood feud, into legal paperwork, into carefully timed public rituals. The goal wasn't speed or efficiency in our modern sense.
No, it was about the appearance and maybe the reality of solemn, unavoidable state control.
Precisely. By the time that 4th month rolled around, the initial passion, ideally, had been forced into this rigid legal framework.
But here's something that seems counterintuitive. They didn't try to stamp out personal hostility entirely. In fact, it seems like they integrated it right into the legal strategy. You mentioned ecthra.
Yes, ecthra. Pre-existing enmity, deep-seated personal hostility between the prosecutor and the defendant.
Why would prosecutors actually tell the jury about this? Wouldn't that sound like admitting bias, admitting prejudice?
Well, this is where Athenian legal strategy gets really fascinating and quite different from ours. Admitting you had ecthra against the defendant actually made your prosecution seem more honorable, not less.
More honorable? How does that work?
Because in Athenian court culture, there was this constant fear of what they call sycophancy.
Ah, right. The idea of someone bringing lawsuits just to extort money without any genuine grievance.
Exactly. Sycophancy was seen as a major threat to the whole legal system's legitimacy. So by claiming ecthra, the prosecutor was essentially proving their credentials. They were saying, look, I'm not here for profit. I'm not a sycophant. I'm here because this person personally wronged me or my family in the past. This is a legitimate grievance.
So personal animosity became a public, acceptable, even necessary motive for going to court. It proved you weren't just abusing the system.
Precisely. It transformed personal hatred into a kind of civic virtue in that specific context.
And the orator Lysias, he was apparently a master at using this, taking it even further.
Oh, he was brilliant at it. There's this famous case where he prosecuted one of the members of the 30 tyrants. His own brother had been killed under their oppressive rule.
So he had profound personal ecthra.
Absolutely. But what Lysias did was skillfully conflate his deeply personal enmity, his family tragedy, with the general hostility that existed between the tyrannical 30 and the entire Athenian people, who, of course, made up the jury.
Ah, clever. He basically said, my enemy is your enemy.
Exactly. He framed the killing of his brother not just as a private wrong, but as symptomatic of the broader political crime committed by the 30 against all of Athens. He essentially enlisted every single juror as an ally in his personal quest for vengeance.
Wow. He made his private fight the jury's public duty.
Pretty much, yeah. A masterclass in rhetoric and legal strategy.
This blurring of personal justice and public duty, it seems connected to this broader struggle within the democracy, doesn't it? This tension between what they called puneria villainy, or just general badness, self-interest.
Just the Silokagathia.
Yeah.
The ideal of the perfect, virtuous, model citizen.
Yeah. How did the democracy try to handle that? Did they crack down hard on bad citizens?
Interestingly, no, not always. The Athenian democracy, it seems, often preferred flexibility over really aggressive, coercive action against its own citizens, especially for things that weren't, capital crimes.
Why is that?
Well, they seem to have been quite practical. They acknowledged that puneria, bad citizenship, often just rooted in basic self-interest, like trying to dodge expensive public duties, the liturgies, or maybe showing cowardice in battle, could never be completely stamped out. You have to manage human nature, not pretend you can eliminate it.
So they were worried about pushing too hard.
It seems so. There was perhaps a fear that being too rigid, too aggressive in enforcing every single civic duty might actually backfire. It could increase citizen resistance, maybe lead to even greater disorder than the original bad act itself.
So accepting a certain level of imperfection was maybe more stable in the long run.
Possibly. Managing conflict and self-interest was perhaps seen as a more achievable goal than trying to force everyone into being a perfect, selfless hero, embodying Kalokagathia.
Okay, so Athens develops these really intricate, carefully structured mechanisms to try and channel violence, channel enmity into the courtroom. But Athens was, relatively speaking, a contained city-state. When we turn to Rome, especially as it grows into this massive empire, the challenges seem exponentially larger. And the chaos of the late Republic really throws that into sharp relief, doesn't it? The whole system seemed to be buckling.
Oh, absolutely. If you connect the Athenian experience to Rome's struggle was just on a completely different scale. It was tectonic, really. They faced this twofold challenge.
What were the two main issues?
First, just the sheer mind-boggling complexity of governing this enormous, diverse empire that stretched across continents. New peoples, new customs, new legal problems popping up constantly.
Right.
And second, they were trying to evolve their ancient law, the cornerstone, the protocol tables, to meet these new needs without openly admitting that those foundational laws were, well, maybe obsolete or insufficient for the modern world. They needed to maintain respect for tradition.
And this legal tension, this need to adapt while preserving tradition, it was happening against this backdrop of incredible political chaos, right? The late Republic.
Exactly. The final decades of the Republic were just defined by rampant vice, public violence. We're talking armed gangs roaming the streets, political assassinations becoming almost commonplace, riots paralyzing the city.
Figures like Clodius, Pulcher, Titus, Milo, basically commanding private armies of thugs.
Yeah, brawling openly in the forum, intimidating voters, disrupting the state at every turn. It was a stark demonstration that the central government, the Republic's institutions, had fundamentally lost control of violence. They couldn't enforce the laws against vice.
So that failure to control these wasn't just a symptom of decay, it was maybe a cause, too. It showed the system wasn't working.
It was absolutely a critical symptom, maybe even accelerated the decay. So the Roman response, legally and judicially, had to be twofold, mirroring their larger challenge. They had to adapt the law itself quickly to deal with these new complexities and violence, and they had to centralize judicial power. They needed enforcement that could actually work, even if juries were being intimidated or magistrates were powerless on the streets.
Okay, so let's tackle the adaptation first. How did they manage to update laws that were centuries old, like the 12 Tables, for these brand new imperial problems without looking like they were just tearing up their history? Especially when the Republic itself felt like it was collapsing.
The key tool, the absolute linchpin, was the systematic, widespread use of legal fictions.
Fictions, that sounds, well, dishonest, like they were pretending.
It does sound that way to us, maybe. But it's crucial to understand how Roman jurists saw them. For them, fictions weren't subversive tricks designed to undermine the law. They saw them as deeply conservative operations.
Okay, you have to explain that. How can a fiction, basically a legal pretend scenario, be conservative?
Because the fiction allowed them to do two things at once. It allowed for the, let's say, contingent extension of an old statute's scope to cover a new situation it wasn't originally designed for.
Right.
Or it allowed altering an outdated legal framework.
Right.
But crucially, it did this while preserving the continued existence of, and the formal respect for, the original ancient statute. They weren't saying, the 12 tables are wrong or this old law is useless. They were effectively saying the 12 tables are eternal and foundational. We are simply clarifying how its timeless principles apply to this new, slightly unusual circumstance through this temporary procedural adjustment.
Okay, I think I get it. It's like keeping the old foundation but building a necessary extension using a clever workaround. Can you give us a specific example, maybe one that shows how they bridged the gap between law for Roman citizens and the masses of non-citizens in the empire?
Yeah, the perfect example is the fictio civitatis, the fiction of citizenship.
Okay.
So the bedrock principle was that Roman civil law, the Annals Civilae, was only available to Roman citizens. Full stop.
Right, but the empire was full of non-citizens.
Exactly. Millions of them. Aliens, provincials, living, trading, making contracts, getting into disputes right under Roman jurisdiction. What happens if an alien needs to sue someone under a principle of civil law? Technically, they can't.
So the fiction stepped in.
Yes. The fictio civitatis allowed the jurist, or the praetor handling the case, to legally treat the alien as if he were a Roman citizen, but only for the specific purpose of that one lawsuit.
So they put a temporary legal mask of citizenship on him.
Precisely. It allowed the law to provide a practical remedy to deal with the reality of the empire, while the ancient, venerable principle that civil law is only for citizens remained formally intact. It wasn't overturned, it was just creatively applied.
That's some serious intellectual gymnastics.
Yeah.
But essential, I guess, for keeping the whole legal system looking legitimate while it was actually changing rapidly.
Absolutely essential. And this kind of subtle evolution, this constant tweaking, wasn't generally driven by big, sweeping laws passed by assemblies.
Well, who was doing it then?
It was largely driven by a relatively small, elite class of legal experts, the jurists. Okay? And they did it primarily through what's called the responsa prudentum, literally the answers of the learned in the law.
So, like legal opinions.
Very much like that. Think of them as operating a bit like modern case law, but based on the jurists' interpretations rather than judges' rulings. They were authoritative, explanatory comments, glosses on the foundational written documents, like the 12 tables or later statutes.
And these responsa could actually change the law's effect.
Oh, constantly. They continuously modified, extended, or limited the practical application of the original texts, even while everyone maintained this crucial, convenient legal assumption that the underlying text itself remained untouched, unchanged, eternal. It was constant, quiet redefinition happening beneath the surface.
And this kind of ongoing interpretation became absolutely vital, you argue, because the traditional ways of getting justice, especially the old Republican jury courts, were just failing.
Failing spectacularly by the late Republic. They simply couldn't handle the caseload of a massive empire, for one thing. But, maybe more importantly, they couldn't handle the political pressure and outright intimidation.
You mean the vis spilling into the courts?
Yes. Unconscionable delays were crippling the system. Imagine waiting years for your case just because the courts were constantly disrupted by political turmoil, gang violence, or powerful figures leaning on the juries.
Were there attempts to fix it?
Sure, they tried expedients. Running the busiest courts in multiple sessions simultaneously, introducing statutes of limitations to clear backlogs. But these were just bandages. They didn't solve the core problems: systemic inefficiency and, crucially, political paralysis and intimidation.
And that failure, that inability of the Republican system to deliver timely, impartial justice, especially in cases involving political violence, that paved the way for something else.
It paved the way for the authoritarian solution: centralization. When the Republic's institutions proved incapable of enforcing laws against possess, when they couldn't protect the judicial process itself from violence, power inevitably shifted.
To the emperor.
To the emperor and his key delegates. Criminal trials, especially the politically sensitive ones, began to shift wholesale away from the jury courts and into the emperor's personal court, or courts run by his direct representatives.
Like the prefects.
Exactly. The two most powerful were the praefectus urbi, the urban prefect, basically governor of Rome, and the prefectus praetorio, the praetorian prefect, commander of the emperor's guard, who gained enormous judicial power. These prefectorial tribunals, run by imperial appointees, eventually just replaced the Republican jury courts completely. By about the 220s AD, the old system was effectively gone for serious crimes.
So the chaos of the late Republic, the failure to prosecute powerful men for using armed force against the state or citizens, that basically guaranteed the death of the Republican judiciary.
In many ways, yes. People, perhaps even the elite, seem to have accepted this shift toward centralized, efficient, imperial authority, even if it was less participatory, in exchange for the promise of order and an end to the street violence.
It was a bargain then. Order for authoritarianism.
That seems to be the trade-off. The central authority promised efficiency and decisiveness, even if it came at the cost of the jury system, and, as we'll see, often at the cost of true impartiality.
Did these prefects have full power immediately?
Probably not. Initially, the prefects might have been limited to punishments below the death penalty, things like exile or relegation. But over time, their reach gradually extended into full capital jurisdiction. The urban prefects, for instance, eventually got the power to sentence even high-status Romans, the anestiores, to death, at least within a certain zone around Rome itself.
So centralization was the heavy-handed but maybe unavoidable response to the chaos the Republic simply couldn't manage anymore.
Arguably, yes. It restored a measure of order, but fundamentally changed the nature of Roman justice.
Okay, so if Roman jurists were busy using fictions to preserve the appearance of ancient legal continuity, that veneer of equality or even consistency seems to have just completely shattered when it came to actual punishment. We're moving now from the theory of law to the, frankly, brutal reality of imperial justice.
Yes, this is where the system becomes overtly legally hierarchical. Classical Roman society, especially in the later imperial period, didn't just have social classes. It formalized these into legally distinct status groups.
The honestiores and the humiliores.
Exactly. The honestiores, literally the more honorable ones. This included senators, equestrians, a sort of knightly class, town councilors, wealthy landowners, military veterans often. Basically the elite.
And the humiliores.
The more lowly ones.
Yep.
This was everyone else. The common folk, small farmers, laborers, artisans, the urban poor, unprivileged freemen. The vast majority of the population.
And this wasn't just a social observation. This distinction got written into the law itself.
Absolutely. It became the formal legal basis for what we call a dual penalty system. This was fully recognized, explicitly codified, from the 2nd century AD onwards, really taking shape under Emperor Hadrian and his successors.
What was the fundamental difference in legal protection?
The core legal privilege of being an honestier was protection from the worst forms of physical violence by the state, protection from torture during interrogation in many cases, and crucially, protection from the most degrading forms of execution.
And the penalties for the same crime could be vastly different depending on which group you belong to.
Oh, dramatically, brutally different. Especially for serious crimes, capital offenses.
How so? What did the humiliores face?
The humiliores, if convicted of a capital crime, typically faced the harshest, most aggravated forms of death. These were collectively termed summum supplicium, the highest penalty or extreme penalty.
And this wasn't just a quick execution.
No. This was often about public spectacle, degradation, and maximum suffering, designed explicitly to terrify other members of the lower classes.
What kind of methods are we talking about?
The sources mention crucifixion, which was a slow, agonizing, and deeply shameful public death, being burned alive, crematio or visicumperium, and condemnation to the beasts in the arena damnatio ad bestias, torn apart for public entertainment.
My God, that's horrific. And these were specifically reserved for the lower classes.
Overwhelmingly so. These methods weren't just about ending a life. They were about inflicting maximum public pain and terror, reinforcing the social hierarchy through state-sanctioned brutality. It served as a gruesome, constant warning.
And the privileged honestiores if they committed the exact same crime, say treason or murder.
They were generally spared this. These aggravated forms, the summum supplicium, were specifically contrasted in the law with simple death by decapitation, gladio ferir.
Beheading.
Yes. Beheading, while obviously final, was considered a relatively quick, clean, and therefore more honorable end. It was performed swiftly, without the prolonged public agony and degradation associated with crucifixion or the arena. Your social status literally dictated how you died at the hands of the state.
And this disparity, it wasn't just for the death penalty, was it? It filtered down to lesser crimes, too. You mentioned something about poverty leading to physical violence.
Yes, that's a really crucial insight into how the economic system reinforced this status-based violence. For lesser crimes, things that might draw a heavy fine if committed by a wealthy honestier.
What happened to a poor humilior?
Well, if the humilior had little or no property to confiscate to pay the fine, the state often resorted to direct physical punishment instead. Most commonly, beating or flogging, fustium ictus.
So if you couldn't pay with money, you paid with your body.
Exactly. Poverty itself led directly to experiencing the state's physical violence, while wealth offered a shield against it. even for the same offense.
And this whole stratified system, it was actually embedded within the laws themselves. Even the laws meant to control violence, like the lex divii.
Yes, it was institutionalized right there in the legislation. Our sources specifically note that the lex divii, the very law concerning public violence, sedition, armed assembly, the stuff we were talking about from the late Republic, and also the lex the adulterous, the law on adultery, both applied ex lege, meaning by statute, in defining the crimes and the penalties. But the application of those penalties then differed based on status.
So the state's saying controlling public disorder and controlling sexual morality are equally important statutory concerns.
And for both, we will punish the lower classes far more brutally than the upper classes. It reveals the imperial state's priorities quite starkly, doesn't it? Maintaining the social hierarchy was seemingly just as important as maintaining public order itself.
So being an honest year wasn't just about wealth or prestige. It was the single most valuable legal shield you could possess.
It absolutely was. It shielded you from the state's most vicious instruments of control and punishment. It was a vital status symbol, and there were even grades within it.
Like what?
Well, for example, serving soldiers, even if not from the highest classes originally, often received the privileges of honest years while serving, reflecting their crucial role in maintaining imperial power. And this also helps dispel a common misconception. Sometimes you hear the idea that the penalties for the free poor, humiliores, and slaves started to merge in the later empire.
But that wasn't really true.
Largely a myth, according to the evidence. While the humiliores certainly faced brutal treatment, there were still legal distinctions. In reality, though, the unprivileged free person was often only a small step above the slave when facing the full punitive power of the imperial state. The gap between humilior and honest year was vast.
This system, this formalized, state-sanctioned inequality and justice, imposed by a central authority that still claimed descent from ancient, supposedly impartial Roman law, it must have just bred incredible resentment.
You have to assume so. It fundamentally undermines the moral authority of the law itself, doesn't it? It creates this inherent instability, a kind of political powder keg.
Yeah. The state is holding the legal reins, maybe tighter than ever with centralization.
But the very injustice embedded in how it uses those reins, that contains the seeds of future chaos. When the law itself relies on terrorizing one part of the population while protecting another, how stable can that state truly be in the long run? And this brings up that critical question, doesn't it? You've established this powerful, centralized legal system. You have sophisticated laws like the lex divii, specifically targeting public violence. Why does it still fail? Why do we still see political chaos erupting?
It's not enough just to have the laws on the books.
Exactly. The answer seems to lie in the recurring failure of political actors, especially powerful ones, to actually choose the legal process over armed power. And when that happens repeatedly, the political institutions themselves just dissolve.
We saw that perfectly in the late Roman Republic. It became the ultimate case study in the failure of laws against public violence, didn't it? The anti-V statutes were right there, but they proved completely powerless.
Utterly powerless. When generals could command the personal loyalty of legions, and when political rivals like Clodius and Milo resorted to open gang warfare right in the heart of Rome. Remember the trial of Milo? For Clodius's murder, it had to be held with soldiers lining the streets just to prevent riots.
A trial about violence needing military force to even happen. That says it all.
It does. The Republic essentially ended because the generals, one after another, realized that their army was the ultimate court of appeal, not the Senate or the assemblies.
Marius, Sulla, Pompey, Caesar.
It became this inevitable cycle. A powerful general feels compelled, or maybe just sees an opportunity to appeal to his troops to defend his life, his honor, his political position, and suddenly that becomes the new political reality. The military physically displaces civil law as the source of legitimate force.
And the rise of Octavian, who becomes Augustus, is maybe the most chilling example of this. Law completely subverted by force, all to achieve what was called a blood-stained peace.
It demonstrates that new reality perfectly. How did Octavian achieve supreme power? Not through the Constitution, not through traditional politics.
No, it was transactional force, wasn't it?
Purely. He mobilized veteran soldiers, the ex-army settlers, by promising them gifts and, crucially, land confiscated from his enemies. He won over entire legions stationed by rivals through massive bribery. He had the Senate grant him magisterial status and powers under dubious circumstances, often under military pressure.
And the purges.
And the purges. He eliminated his political enemies through systematic proscriptions, essentially judicial murders, death sentences passed outside normal legal process, often just lists of names put up in public. And he enforced his land distribution policies simply by having the legions ready to back him up.
So stability was achieved, yes, but at the complete expense of legal integrity. Order was restored, but the law became little more than a tool, a mask, for centralized military power.
That's precisely it. The result was a kind of order, the Pax Romana eventually, but it was achieved only through the systematic, ruthless application of what was often, technically, lawless force, or law twisted to serve power. This is the ultimate example of the state losing its moral monopoly on force, even while it consolidates its physical monopoly.
And even later under the empire, when things were supposedly more stable, when the emperor and his prefects had centralized judicial control, we still see instances where the law isn't just used for order, but as an instrument of pure terror, right?
Yeah.
Asserting power over the vulnerable.
Absolutely. That horrific incident during Nero's reign is a prime example. Remember, the urban prefect of Rome, a very high official, was assassinated.
By one of his own slaves, I think.
Yes, a private act of violence within his own household. But the reaction wasn't just finding and punishing the individual killer.
No, the Senate.
The Senate invoked an ancient, incredibly harsh interpretation of the law regarding slaves witnessing a master's murder. They voted for the full asperity of the law.
Which meant executing the entire household staff.
The entire household. All the domestic slaves, and even the freedmen living under that same roof. Sources say it was around 400 people.
400 executions. For a crime committed by maybe one or two individuals, that's not justice by any definition we'd recognize.
It's legal terrorism.
No.
It was a brutal assertion of the elite's power and the state's control over the domestic sphere, over the unprivileged. The message was clear. An attack on one of us, even a private one, will bring overwhelming collective state retribution down on all of you.
So when the elite felt threatened, the state was willing to completely abandon individual guilt and use the letter of the law to commit mass murder, just to restore a sense of control and terror.
It shows how even a centralized, powerful legal system could be violently applied simply to assert authority and maintain the social hierarchy through fear.
It feels like there's this constant tension then. Law is meant to create order, but sometimes the law itself, either its rigidity or the way it's manipulated, actually creates disorder, or deep injustice, which breeds disorder later. We saw hints of that even back in Athens.
That tension is absolutely perpetual. It runs through every legal system we've looked at. Think about those Athenian citizens wrestling with the consequences, sometimes harsh, maybe even unfair consequences of strictly following the rules about civic duties, like the penalties for hoplite cowardice or avoiding liturgies.
But where flexibility might have been better.
And then in Rome, you have this deep desire for stable, written, ancient law. The ideal of the 12 tables constantly needing to be offset by these clever interpretive glosses and fictions, just to allow the law to function in a complex, evolving society.
So the law becomes too rigid, it becomes obsolete or creates resistance. But if it becomes too flexible, too easily manipulated.
It loses its legitimacy, its claim to ancient authority, its predictability. It's this constant, difficult balancing act.
It seems like a cycle. The law tries to impose order. But when political divisions or economic inequality become too extreme, the law gets caught. Either it's simply ignored by the powerful, like the failure to enforce the vis laws against Roman generals and their gangs, or it gets actively weaponized by the state against the vulnerable, like the whole honestiores versus humiliores punishment system.
And that's the core symptom of decay, isn't it? That inability or unwillingness to enforce the law impartially. The readiness of political figures to bypass law and use armed groups or bribery, and the state's own resort to status-based violence as a tool of control. All of these signal the erosion of true legitimacy.
A state might have the physical monopoly on force.
But if it doesn't wield that force justly, if the law becomes merely an instrument of the powerful or a tool of social oppression, then its foundations are actually crumbling, no matter how imposing it looks. #Ataperna.
So after diving deep into all this, what's the big takeaway? We've traced this history of law trying and often failing to control public violence. It's been a constant, messy, evolutionary struggle, hasn't it?
It really has.
From Athens trying to channel raw rage into these meticulous courtroom procedures.
Through Rome, using these elaborate legal fictions to try and respect ancient traditions while somehow adapting to a vast new empire.
And then, ultimately, confronting that really ugly reality of Roman imperial justice, the dual penalty system, based entirely on who you were in society.
And I think the core lesson, the thread running through it all, is that just having strong laws on the books, whether it's Draco's homicide laws in Athens or those comprehensive Roman statutes against public violence, the lex divii, it's never enough on its own.
Right. The law needs something more.
It needs political institutions that are willing and able to enforce it impartially. The law is only as strong as the political will behind it. When a state starts swapping justice for status-based terror, like with the summum supplicium.
Or when its political leaders just decide that armed intimidation is more effective than the judicial process.
That state has already fundamentally lost the war against chaos.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter how many laws it has written down. Its legitimacy is eroding.
Yeah. Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe something for you, our listeners, to reflect on. Cicero, the Roman orator and philosopher, once argued that for one human being to take something belonging to another for their own gain is fundamentally more contrary to nature than death.
A powerful statement about natural law and justice.
So if that's the case, what does it truly say about the stability, the health, the very nature of a state when its own legal system deliberately, systematically institutionalizes violence and gain and privilege based purely on social status?
That inherent contradiction, right? That codified injustice embedded within the system supposedly designed to prevent injustice.
Maybe that's the true source of the chaos, the violence that the law, in the end, could never fully control. Something to think about.